Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I've just found some tracks, probably coyote tracks, in the moist earth. And I was following them. Though I'm not a trained tracker and I'm not very skillful, I can still learn things from the animals and plants, their activities, and what they pay attention to and when, times of things, places. Today, when I came to the garden, I was planning on getting some sun, and the blue jays here we know each other well. We are friends, and in a sense, in order to get to know them, one could think of it in different ways, but I brought something to share with them. Something that would be valuable in their world, something that they could recognize as a gift. And we've been friends for quite some time, and they teach me things if I'm paying attention, but they also learn from observing me. So we learn together. And they've seen me meditating on a specific bench that I like. And they often hang around while I'm doing that, even though they're aware in some way that this is a time of stillness for me. I remember once, I think the boy flew right past my head while I was meditating, and I could feel the wind from his wings, almost as if he were about to land on my head. But they hang out with me, and then after a while, of course, they're in time in a very different way than I am, and this is one of the really astonishing things about being alive together, is that in the place where we might think of as being the between of us, in the between, the space in between us, not just the physical space, the relational space, it becomes enriched. And their way of being in time meets with my ways of being in time. And in that between, new forms of time are born and expressed that are a sharing of our different temporalities. When we think about the idea we call lifespan, and we think in metric time, seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, we can become confused very easily by these ideas, so that we think that a second is always the same amount of time. or a minute. And mechanically, it's not untrue, but it's insufficiently true, because machines aren't living beings and don't experience anything. So one mechanical minute is an empty thing. It's empty of being. It's empty of relation. It's the kind of time that throws everything away before the measurement is made. And by everything, I really mean a lot. So, a small bird has a different lifespan than me, but it's also in time in a very different way. An ant is in time in a way that's different from a flower, or a plant, or an herb, or a tree, or a whale, or a bumblebee, or a hummingbird. A turtle is in time in a very different way than a bat. And we can imagine that there are these forms of living time that are embodied in the living creatures, and all of their myriad relationships, and the endless dimensions of betweens in those relationships, where new kinds of time, meaningful, embodied, relational time, are shared. So today, when I took off most of my clothes to get some sun and sat down on the bench where I sometimes meditate, I saw a new behavior to me in one of the blue jays. It went to the ground near a bush in the sun, and it sort of cleared out a little hollow in the bark. And then it fluffed up and spread its wings out. And it was a very surprising thing, because I may have seen this before, but I certainly don't recall it. And well, what it was doing was sunbathing. And it sunbathed only for a few minutes, and I could tell it became very warm, because when birds become warm, they often help to cool themselves by opening their mouths. And so, after seeing me take off my clothes and sit down on the bench, the blue jay, who's my friend, apparently decided, that's not a bad idea. I think I'll have some sunbathing too, right now, with my human friend nearby. And we can sunbathe together. It's so beautiful. It's like we might imagine with our critical adult intelligence that it's like a children's story. And I was quite enchanted by this sharing of sun time together. I've never seen them do that sunbathing thing. It may be that they do it somewhat regularly, and I've never noticed. But they've never done it around me. And it's no accident. It's no mere coincidence that when my friend, the bird, saw me take off all my clothes, it knew what I was doing, and it not only was aware of that and could demonstrate that it was aware of it to me in a very beautiful way, it was also saying, we can go together in the sunlight for a moment. Now my sitting was, I don't know, half an hour, 40 minutes in the sun. And the birds was only a few minutes, maybe not even a few, maybe 2. But we were sharing. And that sharing can't really be encompassed by language or concepts or tests or theories. It's much deeper than all of that. It's much older than all of that. Most of that stuff is really very, very new if we think of time in terms of the age of the world, but not just the single age of the world, the combined age of all of the beings that have ever existed here. And this is one of the problems that humans have when we think about time. Our machines have deceived us. We don't understand that organisms form transtemporal hyperstructures of relational time in which there's an exchange, a transformation, a relationship that allows us to participate in each and be informed and transformed by the unique symphony of temporalities in nature. And this I find endlessly fascinating and astonishing. I remember when it first occurred to me that something like this was possible, I nearly lost my mind with astonishment, because I realized that each of the cells in my body and all of the microbial life on Earth is experiencing time at a radically different rate, perhaps 1 day per minute or for a cell, right? And in the between of them, time is exploding like light from the sun. Organisms make time. We can think of this mechanically, but it's not very helpful. You see, each of the processes in the cell has different rhythms. So even within a single cell, there are organelles, if it's a eukaryote, animal cell. And the organelles have their own temporalities within the cell. And so time is a many-splendored thing, and it helps to transfer a couple of concepts that we neglected to understand very deeply because we were mostly concerned with physics, not relation, from relativity. And the first of those concepts is non-simultaneity. No two observers can experience the same stimuli at the same time. And in fact, as each observer occupies a unique world line, it's not possible for them to experience the same thing at the same time. To do so, they would have to absolutely share all world lines, which would mean they'd be the same creature. And there are some deeply fascinating repercussions of this fact in thinking about time. I think we've been misled to think of time like a bowl. And if two things are in the bowl for a minute, well, they both experience that same minute, that same duration. It's not so. In fact, they each experience, especially if they're organisms, but even if they're not, they each are experiencing and contributing to myriad temporalities, not merely the time inside the bowl. It's hard to find a good analogy for how astonishing this is. If we can entertain an idea about it, and particularly if we're able to have the kinds of ideas that lead us from thought into direct experience of temporalities. When I look at the animal tracks I wonder when they were made. It can't be very long ago. They look pretty fresh. The soil had been moist. Now it's drying out. The tracks are pretty fresh. It might be a regular dog and not a coyote. Some people bring dogs in here, and perhaps sometimes dogs get in here on their own. So I'm not sure what made the tracks, but I'm fairly sure it was a coyote. So it occurred to me after my meditation that it might be interesting to talk about observation, to watch other beings and situations, and also peculiarly the senses we have and concerns we have about being observed. Now, this is a really deep topic, and our modern situation is extremely bizarre because now we're being observed, cataloged, analyzed, psychographized by machines for the purposes of institutions, not really for the purposes of people. And that's a terrifying wrongness. Unless our technological cultures crash, which could and probably will happen, whether or not it happens immediately is another question. But unless they collapse, we must expect this kind of thing will be going on far into the future. And we may need to learn how to change the priorities that are involved in mechanical observation in such a way that, at least if they are not overtly healthy, they're not overtly harmful. And it's an accomplishable task. I have some models around that I call the knowledge amp, but it's not my goal to talk about that today. I want to talk about seeing one another and how that works, and some features of observation and thought that are unique in how our species experiences and enacts them. The bird, I do not know exactly what was going on in its mind. I suspect it has a mind, but probably not a conceptual or linguistic mind. Or if it does, it has a very unique version of this. But when it saw me take my clothes off to sunbathe, it thought something. It had some feeling, some urge, its own perspective. And somehow, it decided, hey, that's a nice thing. Let's do that together. Let's have some together time in sunbathing. And it's aware that I'm observing it. And I'm aware that it's observing me. And we're both aware that we're observing each other. And that our nature and interiority is transformed by observation. It changes. It's not the same as being alone. The birds are very clear that we have a friendship. We've established trust. Over time, the regularity of the safety they can feel around relating with me is unique. They may have other human friends. They may have other bird friends and animal friends too, plant friends and tree friends. This place they live in is like an externalized womb. And this is a very important thing to understand, because all of the living beings of Earth are living in a shared externalized womb. And if the womb is damaged, all of them suffer from it. All of them. Now, nature is very complex, and organisms are profoundly opportunistic, so they can hitchhike on all kinds of things. But there are some things the complex organisms cannot survive, even if the microorganisms can find new ways of taking advantage of changes in the environment. So, while damage to the womb affects every being, because it's a shared context, a living shared context, like a womb, we humans have to have special awareness of this, and we're trained to have the opposite. We're trained to offload the damage of luxury and convenience on all other beings. And when we're engaged in that kind of behavior, we're not just harming the living beings now. We're harming the living beings in the past by defecting from our unity and communion with them and the unspoken agreements that living beings preserve when they're actually intelligent. And we're harming the living beings in the future. We're harming our own children. We're harming each other. We're harming the context. Now, it's not possible to exist without causing harm. But there are degrees, some of which are catastrophically misguided and deadly. And our species, particularly at the collective level, but often at the individual level, has made a tradition out of being disconnected from the womb and thinking ourselves separate and distinct, omnipotent, and unavailable to harm. And this is a complex thing because our history is very strange. Rather than living where it's good for us to live, we developed technologies and wore the skins of other beings so we could survive where it's very cold. And we developed ways of surviving where it's very hot. And so we kind of spread everywhere. And we transform elements of the environment into objects, which means killing. And not just the elements that are transformed, but of course the waste that is produced and so on. And all of this is quite problematical, and I can blather on about it another time. Another time. That presumes there is another time. But today I want to talk a little bit about our social nature and our psychological nature, whether or not we buy into psychology as a science or an art or practice. We can learn astonishing things from paying attention, maybe even from outside the context of psychology, so that the insights we might discover there can be translated into other kinds of insight, useful in the broader context of our human experience and interiority. because we are profoundly social creatures, and again, in modernity, and forgive me when I generalize here, I'm aware of generalizing and its dangers. Because we are so profoundly social, various aspects of our social needs can be captured and counterfeited and sold back to us in broken, unnourishing, or toxic forms. And our institutions and cultures have become very adept at this process. And in fact, most of why we're being observed by machines is because there are corporations and companies and governments that want to steal our attention. They want to seduce us into joining their program, whatever that may be. Which gas station do you buy gasoline at? Which socks do you wear? What shoes do you like? Which foods do you buy? How are they packaged? Which shows do you watch? When do you watch them? The capacity for mechanical analysis of our attentional habits and our rhythms and our peculiar personal interests, concerns, fears, outrages, and so on, all of this can be captured in ways that counterfeit our true essence as humans. They counterfeit our needs and sell us dead tokenized replicas or dolls, in a way, of them. But what I'm actually concerned about today are the processes in our minds, and these are mental habits that, once acquired, become extremely compelling, much like addictions, if not actually being addictions. And so we have concerns, many of us, about how we are seen and who is seeing us. Now, some of us have become a bit more sophisticated here, and we may have concerns that are slightly the polarity of that, with what kind of mind or intent am I observing the tree, or the man, or the child, or the woman, or the grandmother, or the dog, or the cat, or the show on TV, or Facebook, or Instagram, or whatever. Because these observational behaviors actually catalyze and require different kinds of minds. Our observational behaviors change our rhythms. They change our priorities, our values. And in most of what we're subject to as moderns, those changes are undesirable and dangerous. But in our minds, I think you'll all agree, we have concerns about how we are viewed, how we are seen, what others might think, what possible others might think, right? In other words, theoretical others, average people, the common people, the normal people, the ordinary people, what the authorities will think, the police, the government, the institutions, what they will make of our behavior, and whether or not they will try to punish us or deprive us of something essential. And even when we are thinking in our minds, essentially by ourselves, these concerns can become so profound that in our thoughts, the idea of possible others observing us can transform so that we experience it, specific implementations or styles of it. We can come to imagine that our worst fears are always happening, that people and corporations and institutions that observe us are observing us with malign or judgmental or critical intention. And sometimes that's true, but our minds are so malleable, so changeable, that we can have the experience of being tortured by observation even when none is occurring. We can have the experience of being tortured by the possibility of judgment rendered into the fact of being judged by our imaginations. And in our minds, we can't tell the difference between that and actually judgmental or hateful or malign intentions in others. Often when I'm speaking with someone I love or care for, I will hear in their speech the sounds of the particular music of the intrusion of an inner critic or judge or analyst or comparator. And people will ask me questions like, is it weird that I don't feel the urge to smile when I see other people? Or they'll actually just say, I must be weird because I don't participate in some behavior that's considered by theoretical cohorts in my mind, imagined populations of normal people, quote unquote. I must be weird because I don't do this thing, or I must be weird because I do this thing that confuses some people. And with our critical faculties, some can quickly become all, and now we're in a trap where our awareness has been compromised by a concern introduced by measuring. And sometimes we may have these concerns when some aspect of our life path and experience transforms, particularly if we've been isolated. Because in isolation, these kinds of problems become much more common and entrenched over time. If we're not receiving positive attention from others, there's an aspect of our awareness, our social intelligences, that will go looking for reasons why. Why am I not being loved? Why do I always eat alone? Why am I unworthy of the care and concern that I see others apparently sharing in their life? And these questions have the propensity to form processes, and those processes become more elaborate and dominant in our consciousness when we're isolated, or in crisis, or when we're sick, or dysregulated. The harmonies of the rhythms of our bodies and metabolisms and thoughts become dysregulated. And that's a strange word, dysregulated. What I mean is the synchronizations are broken, and so the processes not only can no longer hitchhike on each other's rhythms and activities, accomplishments, something like the opposite happens, where they begin to conflict very severely, and aspects of our mind can literally go to war with the remnants of what might have been a healthy, enjoyable, fulfilling way of being human in our awareness and in our thoughts and in our concerns. And we have another problem, which is that various kinds of accounting can happen in thought. And also important kinds of similar processes can die out and be replaced by things that are relatively toxic, delusional, dangerous, painful, and confusing. And all of us will have some experience of this. It doesn't matter who we are or when we live, where we live, who we're with. We will all have some experience of this. Sometimes I've put some water on the stove to boil and cook some food. And then I go in the other room while the water's heating up, because it's not my intention to watch the pot until it boils. So I might do something in the other room. Maybe I'll distract myself and look at Facebook or mess around on my computer. Most of the time I'm not doing anything very interesting with that astonishing piece of technology. Sometimes I do. And after a while, I will smell something. I will smell the steam, or I may smell something burning if I've waited too long. And then I'll realize, oh crap, that pot on the stove, I became distracted. And as many of you know, in old pots and steel pots and such, when water burns, it's really a problem. And it's actually kind of a crazy idea that water can burn, but the pot on the stove is kind of a crazy thing. So what's happening there is a sentinel process, a process that watches over something. First, I get distracted, so that process isn't getting the funding in awareness of attention that it would otherwise get. And when that happens, the process may wake up a bit later and sort of metaphorically tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, what about that pot on the stove? I give this as an example of a sentinel process. And we have many different kinds. We have opportunity sentinels, things that are on the lookout for possibilities that would be beneficial or would perhaps allow us more time to not do anything productive. For example, when I'm walking around, I often pay fairly close attention to small features around me and on the ground. And it's not uncommon that I'll find money. Or rather, it's uncommon, but it occurs. And so my opportunity sentinel has cached the awareness, didn't mean the pun there, that it's possible to find very valuable things on the ground. And sometimes I find someone's wallet, and the last time that happened, I was actually able to locate the person non-electronically and return their wallet to them. even though I couldn't figure out where they lived or if they were visiting or are they around where I find the wallet. So it was a kind of a peculiar thing where first I found the wallet. It had a little money in it, I don't know, $30 or something. I kept it all together in a plastic bag. And then eventually I saw a man on the street and I said, "Is your name X?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I think I may have found something that belongs to you. Would you mind telling me your last name?" And he told me his last name. And I said, yes, it's you. I have your wallet. Wait here. I'll go get it." And I did and was able to return it to him. And he tried to give me some money out of the wallet. And I said, no. And he said, "Well, I really appreciate it." And I said, "Well, that's a wonderful reward by itself." So there are all different kinds of opportunities, and most of them we're unaware of. In fact, in the vast forest of available opportunities, us humans are mostly a bit like zombies. We pay attention only to those things that we habitually pay attention to most of the time, and thus we're often sort of sleepwalking through life with a broken opportunity sentinel, and in many cases, an extremely inflated threat sentinel. I remember meeting electronically, coming into contact with a young woman, and when we first spoke, I think some people are concerned that I might be judgmental or intimidating because they have never met me, and their ideas about me are based on their exposure to my posts. And I can understand why someone who read my posts might think that I was a very cunning analyst or judge, and their threat sentinel could get quite charged up and think, "Oh, this person will judge me." And that's not an unreasonable concern. If by reasonable we mean possible. Now, possibility is a really strange thing because it's not amenable to analysis unless we can get some data points and some statistics and transform our thought of possibility. We can begin sort of chasing that, and we can produce an analytical framework in which probabilities can be derived. Of course, this is a big problem for our physics knowledge with quantum mechanics and perhaps with string theory. I don't think we yet understand. We're missing something, right? We're missing something really fundamental and blatant. Something a child could probably see, but that would be very difficult for a sophisticated intelligence that was normatively encultured. I hate that word, normative. That was enculturated in the time that we live in, with the ideas, the catalog of ideas and theories and explanations that are currently at play. In any case, I remember a meeting with this young woman, and she could barely speak. It's not because she has any trouble speaking or, can't form words or thoughts, but rather each time she tried to form an utterance, a number of critical observers in her mind intervened and could see ways to frame what she was trying to say as something other than what she was trying to communicate. And because she felt this pressure of her critical processes, and these are aspects of threat sentinels, by the way, she could not really emit a sentence. She would start to and pause, and then there would be an angry no, or a string of the word like, no, like, well, if I know, like something like this, yeah. This person who I'm speaking of is somebody I love very dearly. And I don't judge her. But she helps me understand my own mind with her struggles. And over time, as she realized that not only was I not going to judge her, but that it was very easy for me to love and care for her and learn with her and benefit from her unique life experience and ways of mind. And after we became comfortable together, she was able to speak much more clearly. And that was a joyful moment. And I think has continued, even though current circumstances are presenting very serious problems for the mental well-being of our people. Unfortunately, our context and the way it intrudes upon awareness, dominating it, subjugating it, enslaving it, this causes aspects of our potential intelligence to attack their own origin, much in the same way that our species as an extended cohort is actively obliterating the living womb that all beings here share. So many of us, and I have my own experience of this, are trapped, in a sense, with forms of behavior, cognitive behavior, emotional behavior, mental behavior, that are fundamentally toxic, and once they become well established, they will then compete to remain well established, the same way a corporation that gets funding competes not necessarily to solve the problems it may have been formed to solve, but instead to survive and distribute itself as widely as possible and grab terrain in the market and so on. So there's an aspect of the way we have minds such that processes that are continuously or frequently enacted gain precedence very quickly, and they can draw more and more of our attentional energy, our awareness energy, our consciousness energy away from the pool that could otherwise be differently invested, be differently enacted, be differently embodied. And all of us have some exposure to these problems. And for some of us, we have little else. I know and love people whose minds are a constant battleground of terrifying criticisms, judgments, rages, shame, histories, brokenness. And for some of these people, it's very rare for them to get even 1 minute where the sentinels that have become dominant in their mind settle down enough for them to have something resembling awareness, or the capacity to direct their attention according to what is good and true and pleasing, what is healthy and beneficial for them. And yet, even with these particular people I'm thinking of, when we are together, we both transform, because the relational between of us has opportunities that their mind on its own doesn't have, and that my mind on its own doesn't have. So in that relational between, we can choose to create a context that nurtures and celebrates our capacities for loving kindness, for clear, undivided attention, for play, for wonder, for anamnesis, the remembering of ourselves, the remembering of our origins, natures, potentials, opportunities. And sometimes it can take quite some time to usefully contend with the processes and concerns, fears and agonies that we are both carrying in our unique ways. Somehow we have to find a way to sweep all that aside momentarily, or set it down, so that there's some energy available to us to invest in a way that's mutually nourishing, nurturing, healing, inspired, and beautiful. But we do. Even if it's a struggle, even if it takes hours, sometimes, to drill down through the highly structured, habitual layers of historical inaction and dominance of threat sentinels and harm accountants and fear. Yet we do. And when we do, it's as if we've both been released from prisons. And somehow, even if I'm not as fraught in my mind as they may be, when we achieve a moment of freedom together, I am profoundly excited and happy and joyful. And it feels really worth the effort to have slogged through all of the kind of toxic effluent that our isolation can build up. And when they see that blue sky of opportunity and freedom, even if just for a moment, part of me that was caged goes free. And we enjoy that liberation together. And that seems to me to be beautiful and human, trustworthy and true. Most of us live the life of our minds is imprisoned in layers and layers of structured histories of enacting various sentinels, and it's terribly unfortunate that when we are children we're introduced to the idea of courtrooms and legalisms and justice, because those things have nothing really to do with justice. Those are counterfeits of justice. in almost every case. Again, there may be exceptions, again, I'm generalizing, but the courtroom idea that if only our case could be heard, people would finally understand why we seem different from what they expect. Why we did something that's ordinarily thought of as wrong or bad or selfish or greedy or violent. If we could tell the whole case, then others would finally see the suffering we've been stewing in, often for decades, sometimes for lifetimes. And there's something to that. I don't wish to dismiss it entirely, and yet it's a broken model of justice, the whole courtroom, prison, nightmare that has been with our people for so long. And there are good examples of other peoples who don't play that way. And for them, justice means the return to relational harmony, not the accounting of harm, debt, and punishment as payment for debt. For when we engage in wrongdoing, there's no escaping the debt, even if superficially we're not punished or, charged. And we needn't fear that. In the fullness of time, our debts are taken care of. They dissolve in various ways and transform. But it's not my goal here to talk much about that. What I'm more concerned about is that our minds imagine, and I'm not using the word simulate on purpose here, our minds are imaginal societies. And so when we're taught about courtrooms, we establish courtrooms in our minds, courtroom-like processes that we use to determine whether we've been harmed or done harm or deserve something or don't, and so on. And this is extremely confusing and confused because in a healthy communal village or a small cohort, relation and its harmonies and benefits would naturally acquire precedence to any kind of abstract theory or model. And this is really the problem here. It's abstraction. And what I mean by abstraction is departure from actual relation with our own interiority, the relational between and the interiorities of others, other beings, other humans. So that the result is kind of a dead model, formed not in relation, but in something that sometimes resembles rational thought, but is rarely full-bodied enough to achieve the forms of rationality that would truly benefit our minds in understanding, awareness, insight, and intelligence. So our minds, in a way, are imaginal societies. And when isolated, there's a very strong gravitic tendency for our minds to collapse toward constant observation of threat and what are people thinking and what would these people think and what do those people think and why do they think this and they must hate me. I hate them. All kinds of crazy nonsense gets storming around in the maelstrom of the remnants of what otherwise might have been meaningful experiences of awareness and relation, learning and intelligence, wonder, play, fulfillment. One of my friends who apparently at some point decided that I was just a very selfish, bad person. This doesn't happen very often, but it does happen occasionally. And broke off contact with me. I remember him telling me once that when he's walking down the street, he finds it extremely troubling and disturbing that he can't see what's going on behind him. And many of the processes that I've been speaking about have this strange propensity to look backward, to reprocess histories in an attempt to understand a couple of things. What went wrong? How did I get in trouble? Why was I judged? Why was I evicted from relationships? Why am I alone? Where is the family? Where are the beloved others? Why is it so empty in here? Now, of course, since we imagine societies, we take our cues for their forms, purposes, and structures from the imprintings we underwent in childhood and throughout our lives. We take cues from what I think is misnamed as culture. Because most of what is pointed at by this word isn't really culture at all. It's a bunch of mimetic, contagious garbage and poison, really. So if we bring those processes inside and build our little inner sociums in their image, it's quite likely that nightmares will ensue. Now, not all of us are as vulnerable to this. Some of us are extremely vulnerable to this, in that we're inclined toward these vulnerabilities. And others of us become vulnerable when conditions are really challenging. And isolation for humans is one of the most challenging of conditions. I imagine that vast throngs of people have lived and died in terrible isolation. However, in the modern situation, it's much weirder. And it's deeply troubling because we can be completely surrounded by people in the heart of a metropolis and still have no meaningful relationships, no positive observation of beloved others, no praise, no celebration of our being here together. And that presents an irresolvable conflict to the Sentinels who might otherwise attempt to understand something useful about why we may be isolated or injured or sick or in poverty. And this form of exacerbated hyperbolic conflict is everywhere in our common daily experience. For most of the evolution of our people, it wasn't possible to be in constant exposure to people with whom we share no common agreements, ceremonies, values. For most of our evolution, I think we lived in relatively small, very intimate groups. And in small, intimate groups, it's still possible to become isolated, but it's not probable. It doesn't happen very often. And when it does, it's often the sign that something has gone wrong, and the origins of that problem have to be looked into together so that it can be resolved. And this was, for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, the common experience of being human is that we would do this together. When something went sideways, we would go looking for its origins and attempt to resolve them at the origins rather than in the symptom that arose in a particular individual, so that if there was a problem with an individual, the cohort would recognize, we've been making a mistake somewhere, otherwise this problem would not have emerged. And they would go questing for the origin of the problem. And then there would be care, attention, and awareness, ceremony, sacrifice, perhaps, and celebration. Unfortunately for us, we live in kind of the opposite situation, where once there's a problem, we attack the expressor of the problem. We presume it's the expressor's fault. This would be like presuming, I don't know, that if I acquired an infection, there must be a problem with my hand, so I better punish my hand. Right? We attack the symptom, and what that does is double down and inflate the facets of its origin that in so doing we ignore. It's a tragic situation, but it's also, it can help us to understand how our minds can become so warped by our experience that we can't form anything resembling awareness. And it's an endless battle of judges and critics and analysts and accountants and jailers and punishers and torturers and so on. Now, I don't want to give the impression that because I have some awareness of these things, that I'm free of them. I'm actually just trying to understand more clearly, in the hopes that with understanding, we can learn together how to heal each other and also how to assemble contexts, even if they're only momentary, even if they only last for a few minutes or an hour or a day, in which we can do the kind of inner archaeology that can assist us in accomplishing a changing of the guard in our awareness, so that the sentinels are understood and respected for their useful properties, but they don't become hyperbolic and dominant and endlessly hungry like some kind of a ghost or a monster in our minds. And, you know, it's not impossible to do this work alone, but it really needs a village. It needs a cohort, even if it's a very small cohort of 2 or 3. And this opportunity is always before us. Anytime we can together recall the opportunity and its value, and then travel in the general direction. We don't have to succeed all at once. We just have to make a little bit of progress so that we can learn, there's another direction. There are other directions we can travel together in our learning that can be very healing and reassuring, nurturing, playful, joyful, humorous, healthy. We're an animal that is profoundly hungry for meaningful roles, relationships, and opportunities to deepen our mutual concern and awareness and presence and love. It's ironic that an animal so profoundly in need of deep, meaningful social relation is constantly subjected to every other kind of nonsense and pain. It's even more ironic when we're in a context where we're surrounded by others with whom we generally don't relate. Our minds were born in a context where we sought the positive and reassuring, nurturing and encouraging attentions of our parents. And this is true whether we grew up with our actual parents or there were other adults who were embodying those roles. Our minds were born from the hope of acquiring the positive attention of our parents. That positive attention is what directed our faculties and intelligences in the process of learning to walk upright, or to manipulate an object with our hand, to write, to draw, to speak and understand language. And many of us suffered terrible agonies as children, because instead of the reassuring and common presence of the positive attention of our mother, father, grandmother, grandfather, brothers, sisters, siblings, many of us got a lot of critical and negative attention. And we internalized that. And this is part of how the whole broken socium of pain and judgment and criticism and false accounting and courtroom-like situations became prevalent. Though even if we had a relatively secure and nurturing childhood, we're still going to eventually leave the nest, most of us, and face the world outside. Sometimes with the support of others who love us, our actual parents, or possibly our allo parents, right? Adults who, though they may not be our genetic progenitors, fall in love with us in a parental way, and thus take on the role of parents as we grow. But it's very difficult to navigate the modern world without a social basis of support, encouragement, reassurance, positive attention. And there's no simple answer. If we can form cohorts together, little allo families and such, then we have the opportunity to give and receive positive, encouraging human attention. And that's a very healing medicine. And even if we're isolated and terrified and broken and frightened, we still have the capacity to redirect the flows, because our thinking is a bit like a behavior or a habit. And so we can slowly introduce something new and good and nourishing, a little bit at a time, and practice it. And even if we're isolated, which I hope that we're not, but even when we are, we can learn, in a sense, to begin to be loving parents and siblings and companions to ourselves. And after a lifetime of harm in a mind that's disorganized by fear and shame and anger, threat, it's a very challenging thing. But it's still possible to make a little bit of headway, to take tiny steps in this direction and open up the compass so that even given all of the challenges we may face, we can have some experience of harmony and self-care and freedom from judgment and criticism and accounting and courtrooms in our hearts and minds as we walk through life. I myself have experienced unimaginable isolation, things I never imagined possible. And I was lucky for some of that time in that some of the really beautiful and profound opportunities of consciousness and creativity and play and discovery and learning had been so well established that it took a long, long time for the isolation to wear through those healthy membranes. But it does. It can. So I too suffer from the things I hear described, and they're very challenging. The fact that I can talk about them articulately is helpful and useful. And in a way, you can think of this talk not as me lecturing about something I've mastered, but rather as me as an aspect of my awareness, reminding myself of the nature of the troubles, their origins, and the directions toward opportunity, healing, growth, learning, and freedom. Thank you so much for walking with me today, for your attention, for your kindness, for your humanity, and your interest in learning together. I'm deeply grateful. And I look forward to learning again very soon. Bye-bye for now.